Thank you very much, Gerald. It's a pleasure to be here again at the Sydney Institute and to talk about a subject matter which I found interesting. I hope that you would find it interesting as well. The title which I chose for my discussion today is The Art of Counterterrorism. Now it sounds weird, art and counterterrorism. How can we associate those two words, terrorism and art, together? Well, I didn't invent the wheel. I actually borrowed this term from the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu that was talking about the art of war. And since modern wars are the wars on terrorism, I think that we deserve to use the term the art of counterterrorism. Practically, the art of counterterrorism is the need to find the right balances between different solutions, different alternatives, different doctrines, sometimes even contradictory doctrines, in solving the main dilemmas in counterterrorism. So in the coming few minutes, what I would do is try to share with you those main dilemmas in counterterrorism, 5 of them, if the time will let me. And we would understand the difficulties and how this should be sought out and be solved. I've started my interest in this subject matter of terrorism about 35 years ago. It was in my military service, like every Israeli youngster. I was drafted to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, at the age of 18. By the way, my wish from childhood was to be a pilot, and I was lucky enough to be accepted to the pilot course in Israel, but I found after a very short period of time that I'm a grave danger to the Israeli aircraft, so they dismissed me from the pilot course. And then, by coincidence, I found myself at the military intelligence as a young soldier in the counterterrorism analysis department. And as a young soldier and later on young officer, I found myself fascinated with the subject matter of terrorism. Why? Because it was clear to me back then, and it's much clearer today, that terrorism is one of the most interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary phenomena. Think about any academic discipline that you have in mind, and you would find relevance to terrorism. Psychology, sociology, political science, law, criminology, computer science, biology, chemistry, medicine, philosophy, you name it. Give me a discipline and I will show you the connection to terrorism. This is why it occurred to me about 22 years ago that there is a need to bring academic perspectives, to bring academic doctrines, academic tools, in order to contribute to the understanding of the phenomenon of terrorism, and from that also to find better policies and better practices in counterterrorism. That under the assumption that you are not becoming an ivory tower. You come with academic perspectives, but very relevant to the practical world. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do with you today. My lecture today would focus on those main dilemmas, but the case study that I will go back and forth all the time would be a phenomenon which is spread all over the world today. Unfortunately, even in Sydney it occurred. And I refer to the phenomenon of the lone wolves terrorism, those individuals attacks that are being conducted by those radical people that conducted those attacks. A little PR to my book never hurts. So this is the Counterterrorism Puzzle and Global Alert, my recent books. Everything that I discuss here is being discussed much more in depth and in details in those specific books. The first challenge, the first dilemma that I would argue one need to deal with when they are going to discuss the matter or going to approach the matter of terrorism and counterterrorism is the question, who's the enemy? Who are the terrorists? Because they are not all of them coming from the same sort. I would like to suggest a typology in which we should differ between 3 types of perpetrators of terrorist attacks. The first type of perpetrators is being known under the name of lone wolves, the nickname of lone wolves. Well, practically, practitioners around the world today debate if this is still a valid term. Why? Because they would argue that those guys are not really lone, or lonely, if you wish, because they are associated with terrorist organizations, because they are being inspired by a terrorist organization. By the way, if you would arrest a lone wolf terrorist before he conducts the attacks, and you would interview him, he would say, most probably, of course, I'm ISIS, I'm Al-Qaeda, I'm Hamas, I'm Hezbollah, because he identifies himself with a certain terrorist organization, but practically he's not. He was never recruited to this organization or the other one. He was never trained by the organization, and he was never getting any operational ties to a terrorist organization. So the definition that I use for lone wolves, and I still would argue that it's a valid term, is that the lone wolves are individuals that conduct terrorist attacks which has no operational ties to a terrorist organization. Meaning, they might have inspiration. They might refer to those terrorist organizations as the model for imitation, but they do not have operational ties to a terrorist organization. I'll go back to the lone wolf in a moment. The example which I gave in this presentation is Mahdi Namush, one of the first European recent lone wolves that conducted an attack by having a shooting attack in the Jewish Museum in Brussels. By the way, French terrorist that knew that he's under surveillance in France decides to cross the border in the Schengen area. In Europe, it's quite easy. You don't need to present documents, and you can move freely from one place to another place. And then he moves there, and he conducts the attack in Brussels altogether. The second type of perpetrators are what I would suggest to name as local independent networks of terrorists. Now, it would be sound on the face of it as a contradiction in term, because what I'm going to say is that those local independent networks are a bunch or a group of lone wolves. So how come? A group of lone wolves. Because here we are talking about 2 or 3 or small number of people that created a network, independent network, again, with no operational ties to a terrorist organization, have been radicalized together online or by associating with the wrong people altogether. And one day they decide to commit the attack. By the way, when we talk about those independent networks, in many cases we are talking about family members, could be the case of San Bernardino in California, a husband and a wife. Could be the attack in Israel a few years ago in Sarona. It's a tourist center in Tel Aviv. And these were 2 cousins, by the way, Palestinian cousins that had no association to Palestinian terrorist organizations. They've been inspired by ISIS and been radicalized by the propaganda of ISIS with no association to Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or any other Palestinian terrorist organization. The third type of terrorist, this is a different ballgame. This is the organized terrorist cell. This is the traditional terrorism that we know for centuries, definitely decades. Here we are talking about people that have been recruited by a terrorist organization, have been trained by a terrorist organization, created a cell, could be a sleeper cell in their hometown, or could be infiltration cell, a cell that actually have been prepared outside the target or the target of the country and infiltrated for that purpose, like 9/11 if you wish. And then they conduct the terrorist attack. Now, when I compare those 2 ends of the range, the lone wolf and the organized terrorism, I have good news and bad news at the same time in reference to the lone wolves. The good news is that in most cases, of course there are exceptions. Nice is an exception, the attack in Nice, but in most cases, the number of casualties that lone wolves inflict are quite limited. Because how many people can they stab before they are being arrested or killed? Or even running down, ramming attack. How many people? If you compare that to suicide attackers, if you compare that to 9/11, if you compare that to many other types of organized attacks, no comparison. Most of the casualties are from organized terrorism and not from lone wolf attacks. That's the good news. But I have bad news. The bad news is that we used to believe, and I explain in a moment why do I use past terms now. We used to believe that intelligence is incapable of dealing with those lone wolves around the world. Now, you know, you put 2 Israelis in one room, you have 4 opinions, right? And I'm 7th generation Israeli, so I take this to the extreme. I don't only debate with my colleagues, I also debate with myself. So what I said now is wrong. Intelligence is relevant in reference to contending or actually prevention and foiling terrorist attacks, lone wolf attacks, and I will explain why in a moment. But first of all, why did we believe that intelligence is incapable of dealing with this phenomenon? Let's double-click on intelligence for one moment. What does it mean? How does intelligence work traditionally all over the world? Intelligence is usually based on two legs or two arms, if you wish. Humint and comment. Humint is human sources intelligence, i.e. you have an agent in the room who reports to his supervisors. Comment is communication intelligence, meaning you are wiretapping their discussion or you are listening to the computer conversation or whatever. The common denominator of those two types of intelligence, human and comment, is what? It's the fact that you have at least two people, sometimes more, that have a discussion and they share a secret in the discussion, the secret of the attack. Now you can intercept the discussion either by having an agent in the room or by listening to the discussion over the phone conversation. In lone wolf attacks, in many cases, there is no discussion whatsoever. Everything starts and ends with the sick mind of one person, the lone wolf attacker. He has been radicalized, he is planning the attack, and he is executing the attack. If there is no conversation, you cannot intercept, and therefore you cannot have a prior warning. Again, in a few slides away, I will explain why this is wrong. And today we understand that there is some kind of a new or old type of intelligence which fill the gap of human and comment. The second challenge that I would like to share with you today, the first one was identifying the enemy. The second challenge is understanding the rationale of the enemy, understanding the rationale of the terrorists. Now, I bet if I would ask you, or I would go down this building and I would pick up randomly one citizen of Sydney, and I would ask him, in general, are terrorists rational actors? Most probably the answer would be no. How could they be? A guy that is ready to strap himself with a suicide belt and commit a suicide and kill others, this is a rational behavior? No way. Well, I beg to differ. Terrorists in general, and here again I'm generalizing again, terrorists in general, I would argue, are rational actors. Definitely the heads of the terrorist organization, the commander, the chain of command, but also the suicide attacker himself. How can I say that? How can I say that terrorists are rationals? For that purpose, let's discuss for one moment what is a rational decision-making process altogether. A rational decision-making process is a process in which one has different alternatives, different policies, different behavior that he can choose from. And he has goals that he's setting to himself. Now he's asking himself, in reference to each one of those alternatives, ways of behavior, policies if you wish, which policy is more beneficial and which policy is more costly in order to achieve the goal that I set to myself. That's a rational decision-making process. You calculate cost and benefits of different alternatives and you are choosing the alternative which you believe is more beneficial than costly. That's what you do every morning, even with the decision which tie you are choosing. That's exactly a rational decision-making process. You're doing that, I'm doing that, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is doing that as well, the head of ISIS. The only difference is that although the process is generic, the content is subjective. This prism of cost-benefit analysis changes from culture to culture, from religion to religion, from individual to individual from time to time. So practically, when we talk about this cost-benefit analysis, is an outcome of what? Is an outcome of combination of the culture of the person, the religion of the person, the history, the experience of the person, the interest that the person set to himself, or the organization. You can put entity instead of person if you wish, for that matter. Now, if you ask me what is one of the biggest challenges of every expert of counterterrorism, every artist of counterterrorism around the world, is to be able to open his own head and take out from his head his own calculus of cost benefits, which is based on his culture, on his religion, on his experience in life, on his goals. And where instead of it, the calculus of the rivalry, of the terrorists. Understand his culture, understand his set of beliefs, and understand his cost-benefit calculation altogether. Talk about rationality, we need to understand that it's always in the eye of the beholder. That's the challenge, one of the challenges in counterterrorism. The problem is even bigger than that, because if you can learn from what I've said now that there is, I don't know what, Western rationale and then terrorist rationale, no, it's not the case. The rationale of ISIS, I would argue, is different than the rationale of Al-Qaeda. And the rationale of Al-Qaeda is different than the rationale of Hamas and Hezbollah and so on and so forth. Because they have different culture, different experience, different goals that they are trying to achieve, and so on and so forth. So it's different from organization to organization. I would argue that even there is no one generic rationale for a certain terrorist organization. I would argue that the rationale of ISIS today is different than the rationale of ISIS a year ago. Why? Because circumstances have changed. A year ago, ISIS was what we call a hybrid terrorist organization. A hybrid terrorist organization is a terrorist organization that controls both territory and population. The consideration of a hybrid terrorist organization, which is responsible for the services to the people under his, in his territory and so on and so forth, are different from a skeleton terrorist organization, a traditional terrorist organization which is under the radar, doesn't control territory, doesn't control people, and so on and so forth. So the calculus of ISIS, I would argue, have changed in the last year. But until now, I'm talking about something which is easier to understand because I'm talking about the rationale of organizations. What about the rationale of the lone wolves? I want to show you now 4 pictures. In those 4 pictures that I would show you, the common denominator of those, that all of the pictures are of Palestinian lone wolves that just now when the picture was taken, they have stabbed somebody in Israel or run over somebody with their cars. In those pictures, you would see them handcuffed and walk to the police car, probably in order to spend their life in jail. That's the common denominator. I give 4 pictures. I could give you 40 or more than that. That's just a random number for that purpose. But there is another common denominator in those pictures, which I will not reveal to you. You would see it in your own eyes. The smile on the face. All of them have big smile on the face. They're going to spend right now their life in prison. And they have a big smile on the face. It's not a photo opportunity. It's not a coincidence. By the way, it's not just typical for Palestinian terrorists for that matter. The victims, European victims, that have been stabbed by terrorists, by ISIS affiliated terrorists, report as well that as they were attacked, the terrorist had a big smile on their face. I think that the smile tells us a lot. I think that the smile actually reflects the inner calculus of cost benefits. They're telling to themselves, although I'm going to jail, what I did right now was the beneficial thing to do. This is based, of course, on the fact that they have been exposed to propaganda. They have been exposed to radical material. And they have been brainwashed to believe that it's worthwhile to go for life in jail because what they did was the beneficial thing to do. I would like to suggest another explanation to the smile. And I would use one word in order to describe that. Honor. These guys reports to themselves that what they did is not just the beneficial thing to do, it's the honorable thing to do. Because again, that's what they were educated to believe in. This false belief that this is the honorable thing to do. So, what are the motivations of the lone wolves? We researched this phenomenon, and let me show you some of our understanding coming from the research of what motivates lone wolves around the world. It's a group of motivations. Part of it has to do with ideological motivations. It could be nationalistic or religious grievances. It could be political grievances. Others can be motivated by personal reasoning. for example, economical crisis or interpersonal crisis between him and her, a crisis in the family. Others might be conducting those attacks as an outcome of psychological situation, death wish, suicidal goals, or mental disorders, and of course, as I mentioned before, the honor factor altogether. At the end of the day, I would like to argue that you would hardly find a lone wolf that will be motivated just as an outcome of one of those grievances. Usually it's a combination of all of the above. In order to explain that in a very concrete manner, I took a picture of a bath, or if you wish, a container that contains liquid or water. Now, think about a situation that each one of those grievances contribute something to the overall motivation to conduct a terrorist attack. So the water, which are coming from crisis in the family or religious grievances or whatever, falling down, and you see the level of the liquid, of the water, goes up and up and up until they reach the highest level, and then there is a spillover. The spillover is the attack. We can learn another thing which is very interesting from that. That the height of the wall of the bath is very important, because the height of the wall of the bath is practically representing the ability of the person, the psychological ability of the person to contain the frustration, to contain the anger, and so on and so forth. So as high as this wall is bigger, taller, then he would not be influenced by that. The question that we should ask ourselves, for example, why this guy and not the other guy conducted the attack? Let's say a lone wolf attacker have 5 or 6 brothers and sisters. They live in the same condition. They are exposed to the same grievances. It's the same education. It's the same atmosphere. It's the same economical breakdown of the family. But only one of them is conducting the attack. Why? Because his container is different than the others. His profile, psychological profile, is different than the others. And I would like to argue that this wall is dynamic, and it can go down if you are being exposed to triggers. A trigger could be that this person was looking and seeing, watching TV, and saw another guy that conducted a terrorist attack, a lone wolf. He wants to imitate it. That's a trigger. Or extreme anger because this or the other reason. It's a trigger. So that's the way to understand the complexity of the overall motivations that give birth to lone wolves around the world. And all of that is, of course, fertilized by incitement, by radicalization material, by propaganda material, mainly online, but not only online, which actually is pouring this water, this liquid, to all of those grievances, misusing them in order to provoke the terrorist to conduct those types of attacks if he's being exposed to this type of material. When we talk about the lone wolves attacks, we talk about different types of modus operandi. It could be starting from sabotage, stoning, Molotov cocktail, stabbing, which is very common, vehicle ramming, and unfortunately we had in Israel also bulldozing, which is a vehicle ramming with a bulldozer, okay? Shooting, which is also unfortunately common, and using IED bombings. What we hardly see, actually what we don't see, is one type of modus operandi, which is suicide attacks. Now, many experts probably will differ with me on that. They would say, what do you mean? Many of those lone wolves wants to die. Many of those lone wolves actually prepare themselves for dying. So how come you say they are not suicide attackers? When I'm talking to my students in Israel and I teach them about terrorism and counterterrorism, I tell them, you know, terrorism, it's a risky business. So my recommendation to you, don't become terrorists. Forget about the moral reason, but also from the practical side of it, most probably you will die in the attack or you will be arrested. So it's not a good deal. Don't become terrorists. What I'm trying to say is that the level of risk to the life expectancy of a terrorist, regardless which terrorist, is not very high. I wouldn't insure his life. The fact that you have a high risk doesn't mean that this is a suicide attack. The definition that I use for suicide attacks is an attack that the very act itself is dependent on the death of the perpetrator. What does this mean? Think about a terrorist that is having a suicide belt, and he knows very well that either he pressed the button, and by doing that he's killing himself and therefore killing others, or he doesn't press the button, he doesn't kill himself, but then nothing happens. So he cannot fulfill his mission without dying. That's not a lone wolf attack, that's not a stabbing attack, not a ramming attack, and so on and so forth. This is only those types of attacks. All those types of attacks globally, until now, were not conducted by lone wolves. All of them were organized terrorist attacks. And this is an important piece of information. I use the term jihadi zombies in order to explain that and that phenomenon. Why do I use the term jihadi zombies? Because zombies doesn't have any shred of honor. And I want to make it very clear to youngsters which are thinking about this type of activity, there is no shred of honor in this activity. You are behaving like a zombie. I want to show you another jihadi zombie. This, he would come from left to right with an orange t-shirt. And he would attack, that occurred in Israel actually about 800 meters away from the campus of my university. And he attacks all the people which are, all the civilians which are waiting for the public bus there. If this is not a behavior of a jihadi zombie, I don't know what's a jihadi zombie altogether. Look at that. So you would say, okay, this is an Israeli problem. Well, it's not. It's a global problem. Let me show you a jihadi zombie in London. This guy was killing a British soldier by the name Lee Rigby. And you see the calf of the soldier still lying there. He could run away, but he didn't. He stayed there, he went to the calf, he mixed his hands with the blood of the victim, then he could run away, he didn't. He went to the bystanders and he asked them to take out their cellular phone and to have a video clip in which he wanted to explain to the world why what he did was the honorable thing to do. It's not an honorable thing to do. So you would say, okay, so it's Israel and Britain. No. This is another example. An attack that occurred not long ago in United States, when an Afro-American guy that converted to Islam actually take an axe and is attacking NYPD officers in the suburbs of New York City. This is globally. This is happening everywhere. And by the way, in brackets, we see more and more converts which are doing that. Those are not people which are genuine Muslims, not very well acquainted with Islam, but they are shifting their religion, and therefore they want to show how dedicated they are, so they jump from one side to the extreme other side, and they are ready to commit those types of attacks, which in my view proves total misunderstanding of what Islam or any religion is all about altogether. Now let me go back to what I've said before. You remember I said that we used to believe that intelligence is incapable of dealing with those types of attacks. Well, that's wrong. We know today, and when I say we know, I refer to law enforcement agencies all over the world, that there is a kind of a compensation. What is this kind of compensation? This is, instead of HUMINT and COMINT, it's OSINT. OSINT, it's open sources intelligence. I refer to the fact that many of those terrorists give and actually point out their intentions to commit a terrorist attack over the social network discourse. Now you would say, why? Why do they do that? It's not that smart. They have to do it. What's the difference between a terrorist act and some other types of acts? You know, let me, in brackets, talk for one moment on Pittsburgh attack, just recently. The Americans, in a weird way, do not refer to that as terrorism. They refer to that as a hate crime. I don't understand what's the difference between a hate crime and terrorism. So yesterday night, I heard the General Attorney of the United States explaining And he said that if you are attacking because of racism and ethnic affiliation and so on, so this is hate crime. But if you have an ideology, this is terrorism. Intelligence technology and other types of technology, machine learning, in order to be more effective in tracing those messages over the social network. This is an example of a lone wolf that attacked in Israel. Just before the attack, he put some ISIS propaganda on his website. This is another example, and this is Fadi Alun, and he writes in his Facebook page before the attack, "In the name of Allah, the merciful and compassionate, or Allah, today I decided to become a shaheed, to conduct shuhada, to be a martyr." The internet is also being served as a guideline. How to conduct those attacks efficiently, how to use this type of knife and not the other type of knife. After the attack, the supporters of the attacker put him as a model on the internet. So the internet becomes, at the end of the day, a very negative platform in which the person is being radicalized from the incitement, and then he decides to commit the attack, give a justification, political statement before the attack, conduct the attack, and become an imitation model and serves as a fertilizer for further incitement. The third challenge that the artists of counterterrorism need to take under consideration is understanding the equation of terrorism. Now, if you would ask me if I can summarize everything I learned about terrorism in the last 35 years into one sentence, I can do it. And the sentence would be the formula of terrorism. If you figure out this formula, you are a counterterrorism expert. No, I'm kidding. The formula of terrorism is a very simple mathematical formula that has two factors: motivation, multiple operational capability. It means that when a certain group of people has both motivation to attack, regardless which type of motivation, and operational capability that allows them to materialize the motivation, then a terrorist attack or a terrorist campaign would occur. From the formula of terrorism, we can conclude what should be the formula of counterterrorism, the same formula. If you really want to be effective in counterterrorism, you should find a way to lower down the motivation that gives birth to terrorism and lower down the operational capability of the terrorists. Easier said than done. And you would understand that more than anybody else because you are Australians. And you know why? Because when you are lowering down the operational capability of the terrorists, how do you do that? You fight them. You kill them if necessary, you arrest them, you confiscate their funds, you destroy their weapons. As effective as you are in doing all of that, you raise their motivation to retaliate against you. We call it the boomerang effect in counterterrorism. Okay? How to find a solution for this boomerang effect in counterterrorism? This is the art of counterterrorism. The next dilemma is the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. And it comes from a contradiction. The contradiction is that you can be most effective in counterterrorism if you disregard liberal democratic values, if you're a dictatorship. And you can be most liberal and democrat if you don't suffer from terrorism and you don't need to practice counterterrorism altogether. So there is a contradiction, unfortunately, between security efficiency and liberal democratic values. And we need to acknowledge that. The solution is, again, finding the right balances, holding and sticking our liberal democratic, fundamental liberal democratic values and not lose them because of terrorism or counterterrorism, and understand that we are losing some efficiency because we are sticking to our liberal democratic values, and at the same time conduct enough efficient counterterrorism activity, knowing that you might sacrifice some of your liberal democratic values, hopefully neglectable some of it. Finding the right balance, very difficult. I know that we have an esteemed judge here, and the courts are the guideline for that purpose, because security services and practitioners have their own interest to prevent terrorism. That's their mission. And they might, under severe conditions, turn a blind eye to liberal democratic values. Human rights activists are fighting for liberal democratic values, but they don't bear the responsibility of prevention of terrorism. Courts needs to find the right balance, what should be permitted and what should not be permitted.
We've got to finish pretty soon.
This last dilemma, the last dilemma is the tension between resilience and awareness. If you ask me what is one of the biggest success of Israel in counterterrorism, is educating the public to be aware to their surrounding. And you know, I was in United States and I was teaching police officers there, and I told them, you know, you should understand the difference of the mentality of security. In Israel, we have more security. You have this in United States. In Israel, we have entrance control in the malls. You have this as well. In Israel, we have guards in the entrance control. You have guards in the entrance control. In Israel, the guards are checking the bags of the people in the mall. You are checking the bags of the people in the mall. But we are checking the bags of the people who's getting into the mall. You are checking the bags of the people who's getting out of the mall. This is the different security mentality. You are looking for thieves. We are looking for terrorists. The problem is that if you are too much aware to your surrounding, terrorism wins. Terrorism is a psychological warfare. They are not interested in the killing as such. They are interested in terrorizing by killing, by inflicting fear and anxiety. So if you are too much aware to your surrounding, terrorism wins. That comes resilience. The people need to be resilient. What does this mean? Go ongoing with your day-to-day life in front of terrorism. Last sentence in this regard. In the 90s, we had a severe phenomenon of suicide attacks in Israel. I want to share with you this anecdote from the 90s. On one day, it was Thursday afternoon, 4 p.m., we had a suicide attack in Israel in a bus. Many people died and many more were injured. And immediately thereafter, I got a phone call from an American journalist. And the American journalist was asking me the regular question: who I think is responsible for the attack? Why now? What is the essence of that? All the regular questions. But then he surprised me with a question. What are you going to do about this attack now? I said, what do you mean, what are you going to do? Me as Boaz Ganor or Israel? No, forget about Israel. You as Boaz Ganor, what are you going to do about this attack? Now, bear in mind, I was much younger back then, mid-90s. I said to him, you know what? Every Thursday afternoon I play basketball with my friends. I'm not in the mood to play basketball right now. Many people died, not far from the place I live. We don't know the names of the victims. I have family and friends in Tel Aviv where the attack occurred. I don't know, maybe somebody that I care for died. But my personal civilian message to the terrorists: you are not going to interfere with my life, with my day-to-day activity. So without any willing, I'm going to play basketball right now. As an outcome of that, he wrote an article about me, and he put a caricature of mine. And I think it's flattering caricature, so I will end my presentation by showing you the caricature: fighting terrorism on the basketball court. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Professor Ganor. I should also say thanks to Colin Rubenstein, a friend of mine and the team at the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, who brought Professor Ganor to Australia, for providing him to us this evening. So we come to questions discussion. There are a lot of people here, and we don't have a lot of time, so everyone should be brief with their questions or comment. I'll like this. You come back here. What about the Norwegian terrorist, Breivik, was it? Mm-hmm. What was he was a lone wolf too, he was an extreme right-wing guy. What was that all about? What was his motivation from that side?
It's not necessarily much different than the guy in Pittsburgh. Although the guy in Pittsburgh was aimed against Jews, the guy there was practically motivated by hatred to different segments of the society. We see that many of those lone wolves, by the way, and this is very interesting, many of those lone wolves has suicidal goals. They want to die. But in some cultures, including Islam, by the way, also Judaism, to commit a suicide is a religious felony. It's a shame. So these guys that under other circumstances would commit regular suicide say to themselves, why should we waste our life? Why we'll go in shame down the drain of history? Let's do the opposite. Let's kill many others, and then we will be honored by our society, by our like-minded, and so on and so forth. So in many cases, those attacks, and maybe in the case that we're discussing here, it's the same. In many cases, you should understand lone wolves as a suicide by a cup. Suicide by a cup concept, meaning he wants to die in glory, maybe he's afraid to kill himself, and he wishes that by conducting the attack, he will be killed and then will be remembered in glory and not in shame.
Shalom, Chaver. Can you tell me, in general, and perhaps in Israel would be the best way to look at it, terrorists who are caught and then jailed, once they're in jail, sure they'll obviously meet up with some of the people, but is there a mechanism to try and undo their thinking that when they eventually get out and that they won't be like they were? Can you tell us a little bit on that?
It's a great question, and it's a huge challenge, not just in Israel, worldwide. What we see until today, it's not only that the jail system do not de-radicalize the terrorists, actually the opposite. Many of the lone wolves and other attackers in, say, Europe, have been radicalized in the prison system. They were imprisoned for, say, petite crime, has nothing to do with political grievances or terrorism whatsoever, and they've been exposed to this radical material and radical thoughts within the prison system. They went out after serving their term in prison, and they become very well educated terrorists, and they vague their jihad or their perception of what is jihad altogether. So the system, in Israel, but definitely not outside Israel, works very well. And this goes back to another question that I was not asked, but I will ask myself and answer in a very typical Israeli way. How efficient the whole concept of de-radicalization altogether. And I have to say that I'm not a great believer in all the programs which I'm familiar with on de-radicalization. A person that has been radicalized to the level that he is ready to kill himself in order to kill others, with very few exceptions, would never be de-radicalized. Having said that, I'm a great believer in prevention of radicalization. If I would have 2 cents, I would invest them in prevention of radicalization and not de-radicalization. And in this regard, I don't think even that the prison system can de-radicalize those which are already radical, but they can do much better job in prevention of radicalization within the prison system.
Over here? Yes? No, just wait for the microphone. Yes?
I'm told that when General Stilwell was governor of the Philippines, he conducted a program that every terrorist was bathed with pig's blood, whether he's dead or alive. And I'm told that that worked very efficiently.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, this is a challenge that we have faced, and well, especially when we talk about suicide attackers. The idea was, and it was used in the history, the idea is, since those guys believe that once they will will die in a terrorist attack, they have the fast track, the highway to heaven, and they will be showered with so many benefits in heaven. Again, a rational calculation, if you believe in this bullshit. Can I say bullshit?
You said it.
Okay. So, if you really believe in that, at the end of the day, it makes a lot of sense to conduct those atrocities, because you will have those benefits, especially, by the way, when you talk about chauvinist, patriarchal society that doesn't let any association between a female and a male before marriage. And hormones are working. There is no way that he would fulfill his desires, and that's a great way. I'm going to have 72 virgins in heaven. Just conduct a shuhadat and become a shaheed and become a martyr. So one of the ideas was that if the remains of the terrorists will be mixed with the blood or the skin of a pig, which is a contempt in Islam, as it's in Judaism as well, then he will not be purified enough to get to heaven. So all those benefits will be prevented for him. Although it makes sense, and although I think in counterterrorism we need to think out of the box, I think it won't work. I'm against it. Not just because of moral standards questions, that's not the issue. Because by the belief or the misinterpretation of Islam by those guys that incite for terrorism, that incite to use suicide attacks, they argue that, and I quote, that when the first drop of blood is being shedded from the body of the shaheed, of the martyr, he's already knocking on the doors of heaven. So even if you would have special police cars with pigskin in the baggage, it will take some time until they would come with a siren and would be able to do that, and you already have fun in heaven. So I don't think it would work. We should think out of the box, but in different ways and not necessarily that way.
Thank you, Professor Ganor. It's a great talk, and allow me to ask you questions.
Thank you.
Just two questions briefly. The first one, I read about this airline, Israeli airline. I don't know how you call that airline is.
Iran?
Israeli airline.
Airline, the El Al.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, yes. So they have a very high record in terms of security by given like the area they operate is very risky, but their safety, their security record is very, very one of the top. So can you share some idea, what kind of method, why, because they operate in that region, very risky.
So why does it work? I think we'll stop there.
Yeah.
And the second question is, you were talking about the balance between the democracy, freedom of speech, and the security. Is that I want to ask those people, terrorists coming to the West, is that also the weakness they see, because it's very hard to say censorship of this terrorist propaganda. You cannot very hard in the West. We stop this website, so these young people get radicalized, and also
okay, we've got to stop there.
Okay.
We just got a lot of
Well,
people.
I'll try to be brief. As for El Al, the need is the mother of all inventions, as we know. And unfortunately, we in Israel had the need to be innovative in counterterrorism thinking, decision-making, in adopting technology, creating technology which will be effective, and also specific procedures. In the modern history, Israel, since the independence of the state in 1948, finds itself facing wave after wave after wave of different types of terrorist attacks. In a way, we are the testing pad of the terrorists, that they see how it works vis-a-vis Israel, and then they adopt it in other parts of the world. We were the first to deal with different types of hostage barricade situations. We were the first to deal with hijackings that you refer to them, the first to deal with suicide attacks, and then all the rest, and lone wolves, and so on and so forth. In reference to the hijackings, we have developed few measures, among many others. For example, sealed door at the cockpit. It was only in El Al. Now you have it in most of the airlines. But the sealed door prevents the ability of people to get into the cockpit and hijack the airplane. Okay, Air Marshal, it's an Israeli invention. And now it's being adopted by some other companies as well. And also the security briefing that every passenger is need to go over when he's climbing to an El Al airplane. A security guy approach him and asking questions, and he immediately see the reaction of the guy. And that's also prevented concrete terrorist attacks in the past. As for prevention of online radicalization, huge challenge. I agree with you, especially it's a huge challenge because there is no sense of borders here. You could be, I don't know what, Uyghur terrorist in China, that you are writing propaganda material that supports Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You use servers in United States, and you incite people in Europe. So the outcome is that you need to understand, we need to understand, that no state alone can deal with this phenomenon of terrorism. The slogan that we use in my organization, ICT in Israel, the Institute for Counter-Terrorism, it takes a network to beat a network. And only once we would understand that, we will be able to contend with incitement, with terrorism fundraising, with many other aspects which has a global impact altogether.
There's a woman up there. We've got to be brief, okay?
Yes, in reference to from America and his idea that it was hate crime, and because those words passed through my mind, With all your experience and your effect on 9/11, isn't there a way that you can influence them and tell them that it was a terrorist attack and not hate? I mean,
for those who didn't pick it up, the suggestion is that some Americans erred by saying the shooting in Pittsburgh at the weekend was a hate crime, not a terrorist attack.
Yeah. I'll give you a very interesting example. In 1991, a very extreme Jew, Rabbi Meir Kahana, was visiting United States, New York City, and he was assassinated during his lecture by an Islamist jihadist answering the name Said Nusser, an Egyptian that immigrated to United States. The assassinator ran away, they captured him, and they brought him to trial. What was the allegation, the felony? Hate crime, not terrorism. And because it was hate crime and not terrorism, the investigation was not federal, it was local investigation. 2 years after that, 1993, there was the first attack on the World Trade Center, where a blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, and his gang, terrorist group, actually tried to smuggle into the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, a car full with explosive device. They blew it up. The building didn't collapse as they expected. A few stories were destroyed. Some people died. It was not an atrocity like 9/11, 10 years after. But only then they found out that Said Nusser was part of the plot. If they would have a thorough investigation, like a terrorist investigation, they would connect the dots. 9/11, it's all about connecting the dots. I mean, the Hamburg cell, that was the embryonic cell that created the attack prepared in Germany, was under surveillance of the German intelligence services. But they didn't share that with the CIA. The CIA knew, based on their intelligence, that something is going to happen, that Al-Qaeda is going to conduct an attack. They didn't know where, and they didn't know what would be the modus operandi. The FBI arrested 2 weeks before the attack Zakaria Moussaoui, the 20th suicide attacker of 9/11, when he came to a flying school in Florida, and the instructor was struck by the fact that he doesn't want to learn how to take off or to land, only how to fly. So he was smart enough to call in the FBI. They arrested him, but they didn't connect the dots. They had the modus operandi, they had the organization, they had so many activities. Connecting the dots, understanding that, and practically it takes a network to beat a network internally between those services in the same country, and globally between services outside the country and this specific country altogether.
Now, we've run out of time to discuss one final question, because you raised an important issue. How would someone in the prison system, say in New South Wales or Victoria, prevent radicalisation? I mean, how do you prevent it?
Well, it's a very, very difficult question, and I wish I could have a good answer to that. I don't have a good answer to that because I don't think that anybody yet find a real solution. But the prevention is coming from understanding aspects of Islam. Let me explain that for one moment. I was giving a talk in Brussels a few years ago, and just before I was giving my talk, there was an imam coming from Sudan, a Muslim religious cleric, and he was preaching to the audience, and he said to them, how dare you refer to Islam as if it is something to do with terrorism? Do you know what Islam is all about? Islam is the religion of peace and clemency. You're using all the time the term Jihadi terrorism. Do you know what Jihad is all about? Jihad is all about doing good deeds and not those atrocities. Then was my turn. He was still in the room, so I approached him directly in the opening of my lecture, and I said, my friend, let me sincerely, and I mean it, thank you from the bottom of my heart that you took the trouble to fly all over the way from Sudan to Brussels to share with us those two important messages, that Islam is religion of peace and clemency, and jihad has nothing to do with terrorism. But between you and me, my friend, I don't really understand why did you bother to fly all over the way from Sudan to Brussels to share those messages with us. We are non-Muslims. I'm a Jew. Most of the people in the crowd are Christians. We are non-Muslims. It's important for us to know that, but you have a task in your life. You should spend every minute of your life in preaching those messages to your own congregations, to your own society. Tell them that what they do is against Islamic concepts and jihadi verdicts, because you are right. They misinterpret, they misuse your religion. My friend, we do not have a problem with Islam or any other religion, but there is a big problem in Islam right now, that you, the Muslims, need to solve. Not as a favor for us as Westerners, for your own sake, to save your precious Islam from those Islamists and jihadists which hijack your religion. That's the kind of message I think needed to be done in the prison system and out of the prison system.
Many thanks.